Hello and welcome to the show. My name is Blackstone Joe and you're listening to episode 66 of Slick Talk. I have a few things I want to break down on today's show, the first of which being a sample that I looked at just before I sat down to record. This oil came from a Continental A65 engine. A few elements read high next to our averages for the engine type, but aluminum was the focal point. From the pistons, this sample contained enough aluminum to raise the possibility of a problem. Before jumping to any conclusions, though, I wanted to reach out and talk to the customer about the context surrounding this sample, especially after I noticed that mineral oil was in use. Aircraft owners that are listening probably know where I'm going with this, because with mineral oil, there tends to be recent work, new parts, the possibility of wear-in causing high metals, along with high silicon, which this sample also had. The owner was able to return my call, and I'm glad they did. I learned of multiple cylinders having been rebuilt in just the last 20 hours. With that, odds are good the sample contained quite a bit of wear-in and sealer material that had yet to wash out. Now, it's still important to take a careful approach in situations like these. You never want to write off high metals as just wear-in and not acknowledge the possibility of there also being extra wear, but there is reason to extend leeway, especially if the owner is noticing signs of successful wear-in, such as normal temps, stable oil consumption, and decreasing amounts of visible metal, if any, in the oil filter. Next up, we have another catchpan segment. Friend of the program, Ramiro, mentioned that they were interested in V-twin motorcycles, what we might see in terms of synthetic compared to conventional oil. I thought this might be a good opportunity to talk about one hallmark, not just of V-twin motorcycles, but really any motorcycle engine, something that we expect to see, but maybe not all of our listeners do. And maybe some of our listeners have sampled their V-twin engine and have seen this result, and they might have some lingering concerns. So I figured I'd talk about it today, and that is low viscosity readings in used oil samples from really both V-twin and just motorcycle engine types in general. Low viscosity measurements are really common, and not because of excess fuel thinning the oil down. It's common to see a low viscosity in these engines just from harmless shearing. And when we talk about it being harmless, we're taking into account how the rest of the sample looks. It's never going to be a flippant remark where we aren't paying attention to how the rest of the results panned out. If you're looking at a sample where the viscosity is low, but wear metals are in good standing, you have a TBN with active additive remaining, no contamination, especially from fuel, and you have an engine type where we're used to seeing a low viscosity even in the absence of excess fuel, it's really not a concern in the long run, not something you need to worry about correcting. I know it can be frustrating. You want to have a highlight-free report. I certainly understand that. But if you're an owner of a V-twin engine and you send in a sample and you see a low viscosity, it's not a red flag telling you, hey, you need to buy a different oil. You have to consider a different additive package or an aftermarket additive. It's not that, truly. And also, be sure that we are acknowledging both the viscosity and any other factors that might be related when we evaluate that measurement and whether or not it's concerned. And again, usually this is a result of harmless shearing, but we always take into account the way the rest of the sample looks before labeling it as such. Back in the early days of Slick Talk, I believe episode 3 it was, we talked about extended oil use, and it comes up every now and again in the form of other topics, but I wanted to go back to it, especially in the context of a common scenario, let's say. And this kind of speaks to the question of, are you interested in extended oil use and what we mean by that, as well as factors such as calendar time. So if you've ever thought about going longer between oil changes, or if you're not sure what that question means, or exactly what we're taking into account when making interval recommendations, stay tuned. This segment will have something for you. So picture this. I am sitting at my desk and I'm looking at samples from an engine where the owner keeps checking yes for interest in extended oil use. This question is on the back of our oil slip. You can either mark yes or no. Now, I noticed the owner had a lengthy sample history and they were sampling an oil run close to 3,000 miles like clockwork, and yet each time they're checking yes for interest in extended oil use, and as such, we're offering interval suggestion after interval suggestion in the comments, and still, the owner's not going longer. Now, that's fine. Our suggestions are just that, suggestions. You're always free to do what you see fit with your engine. Now, we didn't have any concerns to note that would have stopped the engine from going longer, nothing in the form of high wear, contamination, any other issues with the oil's physical properties. Still, the owner wasn't going longer between oil changes, so what gives? Well, I looked a bit longer at the file and noticed that the customer was changing the oil once a year. And upon further investigation, I found out that the owner was indeed wanting to go longer between oil changes, but wasn't because they had trouble racking up our recommended interval inside of a year. We know a lot of owners that, at least until they start having us analyze their oil, will assume this same thing, that you have to change the oil once a year, regardless of the mileage. Here's the good news, though, in that you can put calendar time aside when coming up with an oil change interval. Modern engines aren't susceptible to corrosion like older engines that had open breathers that would allow moisture to accumulate and cause other issues. And the oil won't go bad just from sitting. It only accumulates metal and contaminants and so on and so forth as it is in use, not just from sitting in the sump. Now, another thing that owners wonder about regarding longer oil runs and whether or not they can try them is makeup oil. Whether or not needing to use any makeup oil sort of disqualifies them from going longer between oil changes. Now, makeup oil is important to note. We certainly want you to keep track of it, but having to add a quart here or there is not reason to avoid extended oil use. We can still evaluate the sample, and we will take makeup oil into account if you did in fact need it. Makeup oil affects an analysis just like you think. If you had a 4-quart sump and added 1 quart, the numbers in the spectral exam, specifically the metals, would be lower by 25%. As such, we will be sure to note if you're using so much makeup oil that it could be masking a mechanical problem by diluting metals down. But simply needing to top off the sump does not disqualify the engine from being able to go longer between oil changes. In fact, if you don't mind adding oil when needed, that's actually a good thing. You're freshening up the additive package, you're diluting metals, you are putting oil that has a stronger starting TBN into the sump. That's all well and good, really. So if you are an owner who has been wary of going longer between oil changes because of calendar time, don't sweat it. Base it on how much you're actually using the engine, not just how long the oil has been in the sump. And makeup oil doesn't disqualify you. Remember, in fact, it's honestly only going to help the engine to have fresh oil in there, so it doesn't disqualify you by any stretch. But if you're one of those people who needs to see the data in order to believe it, I certainly don't blame you. I offer up all of these assurances because I've looked at thousands and thousands of samples and seen the results. But if you want to see them yourself, before asking too much of the engine, you can sample during an oil change interval through the dipstick. That way, you don't have to drain the entire sump just to see what things are looking like. Here's what you do. You draw the sample through the dipstick with a pump. You can buy a pump from us, or you might be able to find one at a hardware store. A link to purchase one of our pumps is on our website. Just go to blackstone-labs.com, go under the product tab, and you can order one. This way, say if you're a 3,000 mile oil change believer, you could run to 3,000 miles, take a sample through the dipstick, send it in, have assurances of where the metals are, presence of contamination, other physical properties, TBN, whatever you need to see in order to have confidence of the oil being serviceable. We'll have it in the report, and then you can make a decision on whether to run that oil longer or not. We understand that owners are only wanting to do the best thing for their engines, and sampling during an oil change interval is a great way to have peace of mind and assurance that the engine is keeping up well with extended oil use. That's all I have for today. Thank you so much to Ramiro for sending in the question for today's Catchpan segment. And of course, thanks to all the listeners for sticking with us through 66 episodes. This is Blackstone Joe, signing off.